morning. Welcome to the STG Azure Certification video part 2. Last time we talked a little bit about app services and how to set those up and some of the things that you can do with those. So this morning we're going to talk a little bit more about app services and some of the cooler things that you can do with those. So you can see here we have our resources that we set up last time. We have our app service plan and we have our app service. So we're going to look at a little bit into this app service and see some of the things that we can do. So let's open up the app service. The first thing I want to talk about is deployment slots. Deployment slots are a cool feature that we have in Azure that allow us to set up a test environment that we can then publish stuff to, and number one, test our software before we put it into the production slot, and number two, use it as a rollback option. So we can publish our stuff to the deployment slot, and then what we do is we swap the deployment slot with the production slot. And what that does is that just does a quick swap and puts the stuff that was in the deployment slot into the production slot and vice versa. So then what we're able to do at that point is if there's something wrong with production, let's say for some reason we put some bug out into production that we need to roll back really quickly, all we need to do is swap the slots again and we're right back to where we were. So we don't have to worry about republishing the older stuff. We don't have to worry about, how do we get back to the way we were. All we need to do is swap the slots. Now that doesn't take care of any of the dependency services, such as, if you've made database changes or something like that, but at least it's an easy way to revert back to the previous website. So the way that we set up deployment slots is right here. We'll click in deployment slots. Now you'll notice that we can't add any deployment slots right now. The reason for that is that in order to add deployment slots, we have to be in one of the paid tiers. In fact, we have to be one of the higher paid tiers. The free tier and even the low-end tiers don't have the option to do deployment slots. So first we need to go in and we need to scale up our app service, which is right down here. So you can see right now we're at the F1 level. That's the free level. We have the D1 level here and the B1 level here. And you'll notice that neither of these offer deployment slots. So if we want to use deployment slots, we need to go into the production level up here and then pick at least the S1. So you notice the S1, we've got custom domains, we've got auto scale, and we've got staging slots. We can put up to 5 staging slots in this one app service. And that's what we're going to do. So for now, we're going to set this to an S1. We're going to hit apply. And that just takes a second. So now that's all done. Now when we go back to deployment slots, you can see that we have the ability to add deployment slots. So we've got one right now. So this is the production slot. So technically, the app service itself is a slot. It's the production slot. So we're going to go up here and we're going to add a slot. And we're going to call this our staging slot. Okay. And we can clone the settings from our production if we want to. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. That way, any app settings or connection strings or anything like that is going to be copied down into this new slot. So we're going to click add. That's creating an entirely new app service almost. Okay. So this is actually going to have its own URL, its own app settings, its own everything. It's going to be just like a full-blown app service. So now that that's done, we'll close and go look. So now you can see we've got 2 slots here. We've got STG Azure Cert 1 and STG Azure Cert 1 staging. And if we go into the staging slot that we just created, you can see we have all the same options over here. So we can go into our configuration, and we have our app settings, our connection settings. We can change everything we want here. If we go to Overview, you'll see that we have a URL, STG Azure Cert 1 staging.azurewebsites.net. So this has its own URL that we can access from a browser so that we can test our staging stuff completely independently of our production stuff. And then once our staging stuff has passed whatever tests that we have for it, then we can come up to here, and by clicking on swap, it will allow us to swap the staging with the production, and then it will put everything into production. Then, if it happens that we screwed something up and we need to roll back, we just do this exact same thing again, and it will roll back that slot for us. Okay, so we're not going to do that just right now. So the next thing that slots allow us to do is it allows us to do some type of a canary deployment where we can divert some traffic to the staging slot and some traffic to the deployment, to the production slot. So right now we have 100% traffic actually going to the staging slot. So we want to set like this one to take 10% of our traffic. What that's going to do is that's going to divert a random 10% of our traffic to our production slot and the rest of the traffic to our staging slot. Now, in reality, we're probably going to want to do that the opposite way, right? We're going to want 90% to go to our production slot, 10% to go to our staging slot. And this will allow us to slowly transition our customers over to the new stuff to make sure that there's no problems. So maybe we run it at 90-10 for a day. Then maybe we run it at 80-20 for another day, or whatever you want to do. It allows us to slowly migrate people over and make sure that there aren't any problems. Then if there are problems, we could even say we want 100% to go here, and then you don't even need to necessarily swap if you don't want. So there's several options that you can operate there. So that's deployment slots. And again, you have to be in one of the production tiers to be able to do deployment slots. So the next thing we want to talk about is auto scaling. So we're going to go back into our let's see, we're going to discard those changes. All right, so let's go look at our resources now. So now you can see we have, it actually shows up as a separate resource in our resource group. So we're going to go back to our main app service, and we're going to talk about scaling out. We showed how to scale up. That's where we scaled up to the standard or the production tier. Now we want to talk about scaling out. So scaling up allows us to throw more resources at the app service. So we can have a bigger server, more memory, more ACUs. So essentially it's just a bigger computer. So imagine taking this from a single core little laptop to a bigger server with multiple cores and more memory. That's scaling up. We also have the concept of scaling out. And scaling out allows us to instantiate more instances of an app service and then have them load balanced. So the nice thing about scaling out is we can make it completely automatic. So if you're in a business where you have ebbs and flows of network traffic, so there's sometimes where you're really busy and sometimes where you're not so busy. Well, if you're doing this on-prem, you have to make sure that you buy a server that can handle the maximum amount of network traffic that you think you're going to need. And so you buy big servers, big network pipes to make sure that you can handle the peak demand. The problem with that is that 90% of the time when your demand is not at peak, you're paying for all of that hardware anyway, and you're barely using any of it. So the scale out feature of app services allows us to dynamically allocate these resources and only pay for what we actually need. Okay, so there's a way to do that in app services. So if we come into here, you'll see that we can specify a static instance count that we want to run all the time. So if we know that we're going to be busy all the time, we can put this up to 5, for instance. So that means that we're going to be running 5 instances of this app service all the time. Now they'll be load balanced, they will be managed for us so that we don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff. But the problem with this is that this is the same problem as buying a great big server for our own on-prem data center, right? And if we're not using all 5 instances, we're still paying for them. So I'm going to turn that back down, and what we want to do is we want to enable auto scale. So if we click on auto scale, this allows us to add instances of our website as they are needed. But even more importantly, it allows us to remove instances when they are no longer needed. So as our traffic increases, we get more instances, and we have to pay for those. But as our traffic decreases, we scale those instances back down, and then we're not paying for those anymore. So the way that we do that is we're going to scale this based on a metric. And we're going to add a rule here. And there's all kinds of different rules that we can add. So we're going to base ours on CPU percentage. So you see here that we have CPU percentage, memory percentage, disk queue length. We've got all these different options in here. And so you're going to kind of need to determine what your application needs the most. Is it a CPU intensive application? Is it a memory intensive application? Which of these metrics affect your application the most? And you can install different rules. So if it's a CPU heavy application and a memory heavy application, you can install different rules, one for each of those. Okay, so that you don't have to stick to exactly one. We're going to go ahead and we're going to do this based on CPU percentage. And then we're going to come down here, and it kind of gives you an idea of what you're running right now. This graph kind of shows, the last, looks like about the last hour of activity. And obviously ours isn't that active because we're not doing anything with it. But we're going to set this to be, base this on the average CPU percentage. And we're going to say if the average CPU percentage is greater than 70% for at least 10 minutes, then we want to increase the count by 1. Okay. Now this cooldown means that it's not going to check again for this number of minutes. So it's not going to check again for 5 minutes. This will help keep us from just spawning up a bunch of them really quickly if we have a spike in activity. So we're going to set this up. So we're going to click add, and that'll add that rule. Now, what this is going to do now, like I said before, is that as our CPU percentage gets over 70%, it's going to spawn up another instance of our website. And it'll automatically do the load balancing. It'll take care of all of that for us. We don't even need to know that it's happening. We can set it up to notify us, which we'll probably want to do. But in general, we won't even know that it's happening. It'll just be automatic. And then if those 2 instances reach 75% and operate over 75% for 10 minutes, then it'll spawn off a 3rd and a 4th and on and on. Now that's great. Okay, so now we've got our instances spawning up. Problem is, when we start going down in our need for resources, those 6 or 7 instances are still running. So what we need to do is we need to add a rule to tell it to go back down when that's no longer needed. So we're going to add another rule. We're going to base this one also on CPU percentage. But we're going to change this to say less than 20%. So I'm saying if the average CPU runs at less than 20% for at least 10 minutes, then we are going to decrease the count by 1. But it does the same thing in the opposite, right? If it's less than 20%, it's going to take one of them away. And again, this is completely behind the scenes. We don't even need to know about it. So we're going to hit add, And now we have our two rules in place. So we have a scale out rule, and then we have a scale in rule. And that will allow us to scale back and forth to make sure that we have the resources that we need to serve our customers appropriately. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about one more thing that I really like. It's called Traffic Manager. So let's first of all, I'm going to cancel this because I don't want to save that. But we're going to go and we're going to create one more app service. So we're going to come into App Services, and we're going to add a new one. And we're going to call this, I'm going to put this in STG Azure Azure Certification. And we're going to call this STG Azure Cert 2. Now what Traffic Manager does is it allows us to have our app services, two app services running in completely different data centers. And if one data center goes down, Traffic Manager will automatically route all of our traffic over to the other app service in the other data center. And that gives us a really good failover capability where we don't have to worry about a single data center going down, taking our website down with it. So we can do the same kind of thing with SQL Server, and we'll talk about that in another video, but this allows us to do it with app services. So we're going to create an STG Azure Cert 2. We're going to say it's a .NET Core on Windows, and we're going to put this one over in the East US. And it's going to we're going to do a new plan, and then we're going to review and create. So what we've done is we're creating a new app service that's in a totally different data center from the one that our first one is. So that's going to take a second. And while that's going, what we'll do is we're going to go in and we're going to start setting up our Traffic Manager. So if we come up here into our search and we start typing in traffic, you see we have Traffic Manager profile. So we're going to set up a Traffic Manager profile. We're going to add, and we're going to give this a name. Now this is going to be the endpoint that we're going to go to for our website from now on. So we can still go directly to each individual website, so our STG Azure Cert 1.azurewebsites.net. But that's not going to do the Traffic Manager stuff. That's only going to go to that website. If we want the automatic failover and the automatic traffic management, then we're going to have to go to this new domain. So we're going to call it stgazure.cert.trafficmanager.net. And that's probably not where you want your URL to be. And so you're going to need to set up a DNS record that points to this stgazure.cert.trafficmanager.net so that you can set up your custom domain to go here instead of having your domain be stgazure.cert.trafficmanager.net. So we're going to route this based on priority. So there's different ways that you can do it. You can say based on performance, so you want the traffic to be routed to the highest performing website. So if one is performing better than the other because maybe one's too busy, then it'll route traffic to the other one. So you can kind of do a load balance that way. You can also do it based on a weight where you can say, okay, I want 80% of my traffic to go to this one, 20% of my traffic to go to this one. Now, if one of the data centers go down, it's still going to route all the traffic to the one that's still up, right? Because the other one's completely gone. We're going to do this one based on priority. And priority is just saying send all the traffic here unless there's a problem, and then divert it all over to here instead. So we're going to pick a resource group. We're putting all this into our STG Azure certification, and we'll hit create. Now one thing to notice is that you have to pick a data center for the Traffic Manager. It's important to remember though that the Traffic Manager is not hosted in a specific data center. Traffic Manager is hosted Azure-wide, right? I mean, it wouldn't make sense to have Traffic Manager hosted in a single data center because if that data center goes down, then your Traffic Manager is useless. So Traffic Manager is Azure-wide, and so a single data center going down is not going to affect the ability for Traffic Manager to do its job. So we'll go ahead and hit create on this. And you'll see that we have the deployment is in progress. And it succeeded. So if we go to resource, now this is our Traffic Manager. So right now it doesn't do anything. We don't have any endpoints defined. So we want to go define some endpoints. That's the whole point of Traffic Manager. We can define as many endpoints as we want, up to a point. I'm not actually sure what the limit is, but we're just going to add 2. So we're going to come over here and we're going to click on endpoints, and then we're going to add. Now we've already got 2 app services set up that we want to use. So we're going to have this be an Azure endpoint name, and the target resource type is going to be app service. See, we can have it go to public IP addresses, we can have it go to a slot if we want to, but we're going to have this go to an app service. And then all we have to do is choose our app service. We're going to do STG Azure Cert 1, and we're going to set the priority for this to 1, so we want all of our traffic to go here unless it's down. So then we're going to hit OK. We're going to go set up the next one, and we're going to 2. We're going to have it be an app service, STG Azure Cert 2, and we're going to set this one to be priority 2. Okay. Now we have our 2 endpoints set up. So what this means is that all the traffic is going to go to endpoint 1 unless endpoint 1 is down, and then all traffic is going to go to endpoint 2. Now, really quickly, the way that it knows if it's down or not is it does pings, or it does tries to access that website periodically, and if it comes back with the wrong HTTP status code, it's going to assume that it's down and that it's not working. So the way that it does that, if we go into configuration here, we can see that it's going to test it over HTTP, it's going to test it on port 80, and it's going to go to the root. So it's just going to say STG Azure Cert 1.azurewebsites.net, and if it gets a 200 back, then it assumes that the website is up and running. So you can see here, expected status code ranges, default 200. So if we don't put anything in here, it's going to expect a 200 back. If it gets anything other than a 200, it's going to assume that that website is down. So you may want to go in here and you may need to adjust this if you're doing some kind of security or login requirement, or for some reason if your root site does not return a 200 on a regular get, then you need to go in here and modify this. One other way to do this would be to go to your website and add just a special endpoint for Traffic Manager testing that does return a 200. One that maybe doesn't require authentication or something like that. Some way that Traffic Manager can test your website to see if it's active. And then you can set up your path to check that endpoint instead of the root endpoint. So if you're having problems where it never shows your website is up and running, this would be the place that you'd want to go check that and see if you can figure out what's going on. So now if we go look at the overview, you can see both of these are online. So both of these are returning the 200 status code, and everything looks good. Now if we go back to our app services, and we're going to go into our STG Azure Cert 1, and we're going to pretend that it goes down. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to stop the app service. Okay, this is like stopping it in IIS. Imagine that. Now let's go back to our Traffic Manager profile. And you can see here, now the monitor status is stopped. So it knows that that website is not working, and it's going to send all traffic now to this endpoint number 2 instead of the endpoint number 1. Okay, so that's how you set up Traffic Manager. Once we get into the Azure DevOps side of things, we'll talk a little bit about how to set up Azure DevOps to automatically deploy to both at the same time, so that you're not having to remember to deploy to both, because you need to remember that if you want this to be a true failover, both sites need to have the exact same code in them, right? I mean, if one has an older version, then half the people are going to get older versions, or something like that. So you need to make sure that they're in sync so that it is a true failover. And we can talk about that when we get to the Azure DevOps piece. So that is our App Services Part 2 video. We'll try to do another one of these next week and talk a little bit more about Azure SQL. So we'll see you then.